Before Giulia became the face of a national tragedy, she was a 29-year-old woman preparing for a new chapter, with a son already given a place in her family's future. Giulia Tramontano was born on May 2, 1994, near Naples. She grew up in a close family, surrounded by her parents, Loredana and Franco, and her siblings. Home was not just a place she returned to. It was the center of her support system. The people who knew her best remembered someone independent, determined, and deeply connected to the family that had raised her. That matters here, because when a story is later reduced to a missing person report, a crime scene, and a courtroom sentence, it becomes easy to forget that Giulia had already lived a whole life before any of that happened. She had interests, ambitions, and a clear idea of where she wanted to go. Giulia was drawn to architecture and real estate. She studied in that direction and built a career in the property business, developing the communication skills and practical judgment the work demanded. She was not content to remain in a place where her opportunities felt limited. She wanted room to grow, so she moved north, toward Milan. For Giulia, Lombardy represented more than a change of address. It was a chance to build something that belonged to her. A new professional network, a faster-moving market, new friendships and new routines. The kind of life that requires courage at first, because nobody else can make the decisions for you. She worked, met people, and adapted to the pace of the city. There were deals to close and contacts to make. There were ordinary evenings, conversations with friends, and plans that had nothing to do with tragedy. That is the part of her story worth holding on to. Giulia was not waiting for her life to begin. She was already building it. Then she met Alessandro Impagnatiello. They crossed paths in Milan after Giulia went out with colleagues to celebrate a successful deal. Alessandro worked as a bartender in an upscale hotel environment, a world built around polished surfaces, expensive surroundings, and constant interaction with other people. He appeared comfortable there, sociable, persuasive, easy to talk to. Those qualities made an impression on Giulia. At the beginning, the relationship moved quickly and naturally. They spent time together, went out to restaurants, walked through the city, and talked about what might come next. Alessandro presented himself as someone ready to move forward. He told Giulia that he had a son from a previous relationship, but suggested that chapter was behind him. For Giulia, the future seemed to be taking shape. After only a few months, they moved in together in Senego, a town near Milan. It was the kind of step that can make a relationship feel permanent. Shared keys, shared bills, shared plans. Giulia had moved north to create a life of her own, and now she believed she was creating it with someone else. But the image Alessandro presented did not remain intact. The first changes were subtle. Remarks that could be dismissed as jokes became more personal. He made demeaning comments about Giulia's speech and mocked things he knew mattered to her. Disagreements over small household decisions or ordinary conversations turned into repeated conflict. He could interrupt her, shut her down, or become cold and distant without explaining what had changed. Then, just as suddenly, he could return to being warm again. That instability left Giulia uncertain. One day, Alessandro might seem attentive and affectionate. The next, he acted as if her feelings were an inconvenience. There was no clear line between the two versions of him, and no reliable way for her to know which one she would meet. Here's the thing about relationships like that. The damage does not always arrive as one dramatic moment. Sometimes it gathers through dozens of smaller moments. A comment, a dismissal, a fight that never gets resolved, an apology that changes nothing. The person on the receiving end is left trying to understand what happened while the other person behaves as if nothing happened at all. Giulia kept working and kept moving forward, and then her future changed in a way that should have brought the two of them closer. She discovered she was pregnant. Giulia was 7 months pregnant when she was killed. Her son, Thiago, was not an abstract detail in her life. He was already part of her decisions, her conversations, and the future she was preparing to enter. Giulia intended to continue the pregnancy. She was making room for her child, even as her relationship with Alessandro became more strained. His response, according to the account preserved in the case, was not the support she had hoped for. When she told him, he was quiet, then asked whether she was sure. After that, he showed little interest in the pregnancy or in the practical future that was approaching. Giulia was left carrying the emotional weight of a decision she had made deliberately and for herself. She continued working. She stayed connected to her family. She looked toward Naples and toward the people who would help her if she needed them. Her life in Lombardy had been built around independence, family, and the approaching birth of Thiago. The relationship she expected to support that future, however, was already resting on a deception she could not yet see. While Giulia was preparing to become a mother, Alessandro was presenting an entirely different version of his life to another woman, and neither woman had been told the truth. Alessandro did not simply conceal an affair. He created separate realities, adjusting his history, his promises, and even Giulia's existence according to which woman was listening. The other woman was a younger colleague connected to the hotel where Alessandro worked, and it is important to be clear about her role from the beginning. She was not Giulia's rival, and she did not cause what happened. She, too, was being deceived. To Giulia, Alessandro was the man she lived with and the father of the son she was expecting. Their relationship had become strained, but they still shared an apartment and a life. To his colleague, Alessandro presented himself as single, or close enough to single that the distinction barely mattered. He claimed that his relationship with Giulia was over and that they were only living together temporarily while she arranged somewhere else to stay. It was a useful story because it explained almost everything. If he could not answer his phone, there was a reason. If he needed to leave unexpectedly, there was a reason. If Giulia's name surfaced, she belonged to a relationship that supposedly existed only in the past. Alessandro gave each woman just enough information to stop her from seeing the complete picture. Think about how much control that required. Separate schedules, selective absences, different promises about the future. And whenever something did not quite fit, another reassurance arrived to cover the gap. For a time, it worked. Then, in early 2023, the other woman became pregnant. She later terminated that pregnancy, and the evidence presented in the case showed that Alessandro accompanied her for the procedure. Accounts of this period also described him as favoring that outcome. But that distinction matters. Her medical decision was her own, and any discussion of his influence has to remain tied to testimony and evidence, not speculation. What is clear is that Alessandro was now confronting two pregnancies inside two relationships that neither woman fully understood. Giulia made a different decision. She intended to continue her pregnancy and was prepared to raise her son, even if her relationship with Alessandro ended. For her, the baby was part of the future she was building. For Alessandro, it created a reality that could no longer be postponed, explained away, or kept safely separated from his other life. And this is where the case becomes darker than infidelity. Investigators and prosecutors later alleged that Alessandro had begun trying to poison Giulia over time. The claim was not based on a single suspicious internet search. It emerged from a larger body of evidence discussed in the investigation and later court proceedings. His digital history, toxicological and forensic findings, Giulia's physical symptoms, and the pattern prosecutors said those pieces formed when placed together. His devices contained research into toxic substances, including dangerous chemicals and products used to kill rodents. There were searches about their effects and about substances that might be difficult to detect. Some queries appeared to ask why an attempted poisoning was not producing the expected result. A search history can reveal intent, curiosity, or planning, but it does not automatically settle a legal question by itself. Context matters. Timing matters. Forensic support matters. In this case, prosecutors argued that the searches belonged to a deliberate effort to harm Giulia before the final attack. The courts would later have to weigh what that evidence proved, and, just as importantly, what legal conclusions could properly be drawn from it. During her pregnancy, Giulia experienced periods of exhaustion, dizziness, nausea, and abdominal discomfort. She spoke to people close to her about feeling unwell. None of those symptoms, taken alone, would necessarily point to poisoning. They can overlap with ordinary pregnancy-related discomfort or other medical problems. That overlap, investigators believed, was part of what made the alleged method so difficult for Giulia to recognize. She believed she was dealing with a difficult pregnancy. She had no obvious reason to look at food or a drink handed to her at home and imagine that someone might be trying to make her sick. Meanwhile, the other woman was beginning to notice problems in Alessandro's story. He was guarded whenever she asked about his past. He did not openly share his social media, and his explanations about Giulia remained vague. His work schedule did not always match what colleagues appeared to know. Some evenings he claimed he had to stay late, only for information to suggest that he had left earlier. At other times, he became unreachable and returned with explanations that sounded plausible, until they were compared with everything else. Then she saw recent photographs of Alessandro and Giulia on his phone. These did not look like remnants of a relationship that had ended long ago. They suggested closeness and a continuing connection. When she confronted him, Alessandro did not admit that he was still living as Giulia's partner. Instead, he revised the story. Now, Giulia was supposedly an obsessive former girlfriend who could not accept the breakup. The photographs, he claimed, were part of her attempt to interfere with his life. When questions remained, his account shifted again. He said Giulia was lying about being pregnant, or that the child was not his. And then he produced what appeared to be proof, a DNA document supposedly confirming that he was not the father. It gave the lie the appearance of medical certainty. But investigators later determined that the document had been falsified. Forensic analysis connected it to a file obtained online and altered to support Alessandro's story. What he had presented as objective evidence would eventually become digital and documentary evidence against him. By then, the inconsistencies were no longer isolated warning signs. The other woman had reason to believe that Alessandro's entire account of Giulia, and of his own availability, had been manufactured. So instead of asking Alessandro for one more explanation, she contacted Giulia directly. That decision put the two versions of his life in the same room. On May 27, 2023, Giulia went to meet the woman she had been taught to see as a threat. Within that conversation, both women understood that the real danger was the man who had lied to them. The meeting took place at, or near, the hotel where the other woman worked. It was not a scene between romantic competitors. There was no real rivalry to begin with. Only two people who had been given completely different versions of the same relationship. Alessandro had told the younger woman that Giulia was an ex-partner, someone who had supposedly refused to accept that their relationship was over. He claimed they were only sharing a home temporarily and that Giulia was preparing to leave. But Giulia arrived with a very different reality. She explained that she and Alessandro were still together. They were not former partners living under the same roof by accident. They shared a home, a daily life, and a future that Giulia had believed they were building together. She was also 7 months pregnant with his child. That alone destroyed the story he had been telling. Then came the so-called DNA test. Alessandro had shown the other woman a document that appeared to prove he was not the father of Giulia's baby. It was meant to settle the question before she asked too many more. But the document was fabricated. Giulia had never presented him with such a test, and her timeline matched the period in which they had been together. The more the two women compared details, the less room there was for Alessandro's explanations. Messages, dates, absences, late shifts, and the arrangements inside the apartment all pointed in the same direction. He had not ended one relationship before beginning another. He had maintained both, then adjusted the story whenever one of them got too close to the truth. That is what made the meeting so important. Giulia and the other woman were not confronting each other over a man. They were discovering, piece by piece, that the man had manipulated them both. For more than an hour, they talked through the contradictions. The other woman had been told that Giulia was in the past. Giulia learned that Alessandro had been presenting himself as single. One woman had been promised a future. The other had been told that her own relationship was already finished. Neither version was honest. And once Giulia heard the full story, her decision became clear. She was done with Alessandro. Whatever uncertainty had remained inside the apartment, whatever hope she had once held that he might accept the pregnancy or begin acting like a partner, it could not survive this discovery. Her future was no longer something she wanted to negotiate with him. It was the future she intended to build with her son, Thiago. When Giulia returned home, she told Alessandro that she knew about the other relationship and that their relationship was over. The exact words exchanged inside the apartment were not heard by an outside witness, so no one can honestly recreate every sentence. But the broad sequence became clear through the investigation, Alessandro's confession, and the court's findings. He became angry. Giulia began preparing to leave. She contacted her mother, Loredana, and other members of her family, telling them what had happened and making it clear that she intended to return toward the Naples area after dealing with practical matters in Milan. Her family knew she was distressed. They were ready to support her. Giulia told them she would be back in a few days. That message matters because it shows the direction her life was taking. She was not vanishing without explanation. She was making arrangements. She had a decision, a destination, and people waiting for her. But she still had to leave the apartment in Senegal. At some point during the confrontation, Alessandro attacked her inside the home. The prosecution described the killing as the end point of escalating control and deception. The defense argued against some of the more serious legal interpretations of his conduct. Those arguments would later matter in court, especially when judges considered whether the murder legally involved premeditation. But the central fact was not in dispute. Alessandro killed Giulia and Thiago inside the apartment. The attack involved 37 wounds, a number later discussed in relation to the cruelty aggravating circumstance. There is no need to turn that figure into an image. Its importance is in what it showed the court about the violence of the attack, and in the dispute over how that violence should be understood legally. Immediately afterward, Alessandro did not call for help. He began trying to control what would happen next. He moved Giulia's body to the bathroom, covered it with alcohol, and set it on fire, apparently hoping the flames would destroy evidence. They did not. The fire failed to erase what had happened, so he changed tactics. He gathered cleaning products and rags. He scrubbed the floor, the walls, and the furniture, trying to remove the blood and any visible trace of the attack. But cleaning a home is not the same as undoing a crime. The apartment still contained evidence. The surfaces still held the story he was trying to erase. That contrast would become central to the prosecution's case. Alessandro later presented the killing as something that happened in a moment of uncontrolled anger. But what followed was not a single startled reaction. It was a continuing sequence of decisions: burn, clean, move, conceal, and create another explanation. Giulia had discovered the truth, ended the relationship, and prepared to leave. She never received the chance to carry out that decision. By the next day, Alessandro was no longer trying to deceive two partners. He was trying to deceive Giulia's family, her friends, and the police, all while evidence remained inside the home. The first version of Giulia's disappearance came from the person who already knew she would not be coming back. After Giulia confronted Alessandro and made it clear that their relationship was over, the apartment did not become the scene of a sudden, unexplained departure. It became the place where Alessandro tried to control what happened next. According to his later account, the confrontation turned violent. He claimed that he attacked Giulia during an outburst, then realized that she was dead. But what followed was not one impulsive action and then a call for help. It was a series of decisions. He tried to clean the apartment. He dealt with the signs of violence. He moved Giulia's body and made plans to hide it. The details of those movements became part of his confession, while investigators worked to determine which parts were supported by physical evidence, surveillance, and digital records. That distinction matters. A confession can explain what a suspect says happened. It does not automatically prove every detail. Investigators still had to test Alessandro's story against the apartment, the car, the building, and the movements recorded after Giulia's death. At some point, he also understood that Giulia's silence would immediately alarm the people closest to her. She was 7 months pregnant. Her family knew her routines. They knew she had been upset, but they also knew she had plans, responsibilities, and a future she was actively preparing for. Disappearing without warning did not fit the life she had been living. So Alessandro tried to create another explanation. He used Giulia's phone and sent messages to people around her. The wording suggested that she wanted time alone, or that she had left without being ready to explain where she was going. The messages were meant to slow the reaction. If everyone believed Giulia had chosen to step away, then the first hours might be treated as a private relationship problem instead of an emergency. But the messages did not sound like the Giulia her family knew. She had recently told them that she was distressed. The situation with Alessandro had left her shaken, and she had spoken openly about what was happening. Yet being upset was not the same as planning to vanish. Her family understood the difference. They knew she might leave Alessandro. They did not believe she would simply cut off contact with everyone while carrying his child. That was the first problem with the story. It had been designed to explain the silence, but it could not explain the person behind it. When Alessandro reported Giulia missing, he presented a straightforward version. He said she had left after an argument. He suggested that she had taken some belongings and gone away on her own. The account gave investigators a possible explanation, but it also placed him at the center of the timeline. He was the partner who had last been with her. He was the person describing the argument. And he was the person deciding what information the police and Giulia's family would receive first. That does not mean an intimate partner is automatically guilty when someone disappears. It means investigators examine that relationship early because the partner often has the closest access to the missing person, the home, the routines, and the last known movements. Suspicion is not proof. It is where the timeline begins. In this case, the timeline did not sit comfortably beside Alessandro's account. Giulia's family reacted with immediate urgency. They knew she was pregnant. They knew she had been in emotional distress. And they knew that the messages arriving from her phone did not match the way she normally communicated. The idea that she had voluntarily left without telling them where she was became harder to accept with every passing hour. Investigators began checking the apartment and the places connected to it. They examined the vehicle, the garage, the cellar, the building's shared spaces, and areas around Senego. They spoke with people who might have seen or heard something. They looked for the ordinary signs of a person leaving luggage, documents, money, a clear destination. Instead, the search kept circling back to what remained behind. The apartment did not support a clean story of someone calmly leaving for an unknown place. Alessandro had tried to remove evidence and conceal what had happened, but cleaning is not the same as erasing. A surface can look ordinary while still holding traces invisible to the eye. His actions after the killing created another problem. Surveillance and movement records showed activity that did not fit the simple account he had given. He was seen moving between locations connected to the building and the garage. Bags appeared in the sequence. Items were moved. His phone activity and recorded movements helped investigators reconstruct a pattern that was very different from a partner waiting helplessly for a missing woman to return. The more the investigators compared those records with his statements, the less stable his explanation became. Alessandro had tried to make Giulia appear responsible for her own absence. He wanted the story to begin with her leaving. But the evidence kept forcing the timeline backward, to the apartment, to the confrontation, and to the hours after the attack. His central miscalculation was simple. He could invent a reason for Giulia to leave. He could send messages in her name. He could offer investigators a calm, convenient narrative. But he could not control every record created by his movements, and he could not make the physical world agree with a lie. The voluntary disappearance theory weakened as investigators compared Alessandro's account with Giulia's plans, communications, and the movements recorded after her death. The case was beginning to point back toward the apartment. Then the search stopped being about suspicious behavior. Investigators found biological traces that cleaning could hide from the eye, but not from forensic testing. A clean surface can look ordinary. Under forensic examination, it can preserve a completely different timeline. Alessandro's story depended on one simple idea. Giulia had left the apartment after their argument, and he had only discovered it when he came home. But investigators did not have to accept the story as a whole. They could test it piece by piece. The first problem was biological evidence. When blood is wiped away, the visible stain may disappear, but that does not mean every trace is gone. Investigators can use a presumptive test, a chemical screening method that reacts to the components of blood and may reveal areas that look clean to the naked eye. It does not identify a person by itself, and it is not the final word. It simply tells forensic specialists where to look more closely. Later, laboratory analysis can determine whether the material is human blood and, when enough usable DNA remains, whether it is connected to a particular person. In this case, traces were reportedly found inside the apartment and in places connected with Alessandro's movements, including his car and shared areas of the building. Some marks had been cleaned or partially cleaned. That mattered because the question was not just whether blood existed. It was where it was found, how it had been treated, and whether it fit the story of a woman calmly leaving home. It did not create a complete answer on its own. A blood trace cannot explain an entire crime scene by itself, but it can challenge a timeline. And then investigators had other timelines to compare. Surveillance footage showed Alessandro moving between the building, the garage, and other locations in the days after Giulia disappeared. At points, he was seen carrying bags and later returning without them. That did not independently prove what the bags contained. But alongside the forensic traces, it made his claim harder to sustain. The movements looked less like someone searching for a missing partner and more like someone repeatedly handling something he did not want found. His behavior also drew attention. Alessandro had reported Giulia missing, but investigators and people close to the case noticed that he did not behave like someone urgently trying to locate the woman he said he loved. He did not appear to be organizing a public search or seeking help from her family in the way they expected. Instead, he seemed focused on controlling the official version of events. That control extended into the digital world. Police seized Alessandro's phone, computer, tablet, and other devices. Investigators examining them found searches connected to poisons, harmful substances, symptoms, and ways of causing injury without immediate detection. There were also searches related to concealment and to why certain substances might fail to produce the expected result. Those records became important because they reached back before the final attack. They suggested that Alessandro had not simply reacted to one sudden moment. Prosecutors pointed to a pattern: research, experimentation, an apparent attempt to make Giulia ill, and then a violent escalation when the situation remained outside his control. Giulia had complained of tiredness, dizziness, nausea, and stomach pain. During a pregnancy, symptoms like those can be misunderstood or attributed to ordinary physical changes. Prosecutors argued that Alessandro had placed rodent poison or other toxic substances into food or drinks in an effort to harm her gradually. Toxicological evidence and the digital searches formed part of that allegation. But this is where precision matters. Evidence that prosecutors described as a poisoning campaign was not automatically the same thing as a final legal finding that the murder itself had been premeditated. Those are connected questions, but not identical ones. Investigators could show what had been searched, what symptoms had appeared, and what substances were examined. The court still had to decide what those facts proved beyond the specific legal standard required. The devices also helped expose another lie. The fake DNA document Alessandro had shown the other woman. He had used it to claim that Giulia's unborn child was not his, hoping to make the other woman believe that Giulia had invented the pregnancy to keep him from leaving. Forensic examination found that the document had been manipulated. It had been downloaded from a website that allowed files to be altered, rather than produced through a legitimate medical process. That supported the other woman's account. Alessandro had not made one careless false statement. He had built an explanation, prepared supposed proof, and used it to keep two people inside separate versions of reality. Witness information added another layer. Investigators examined reports of shouting and loud noises from the apartment, as well as Alessandro's communications and movements after Giulia vanished. Each detail was limited on its own. A noise does not automatically reveal what happened inside a room. A delayed message does not automatically prove who wrote it. But the case was no longer resting on a single dramatic discovery. It was becoming a structure made from many smaller contradictions, and Alessandro was confronted with them. At first, he continued to deny knowing what had happened. But questioning became more difficult when investigators placed the evidence in front of him. The traces that remained after cleaning, the searches on his devices, the surveillance footage, the fake document, and the gaps in his account. The pressure did not produce an unprompted confession of remorse. His original story became unsustainable as the separate pieces began to point in the same direction. Eventually, Alessandro admitted that he had killed Giulia. He also directed authorities to the place where he had concealed her body. 4 days after the murder, on June 1st, 2023, Giulia was recovered from an overgrown area near Senegal. The location ended one part of the investigation, the search for where she had been taken. But it opened another. What exactly had happened inside the apartment, and how much of it had been planned before the fatal attack? Giulia was formally identified, and a post-mortem examination was carried out. Investigators were able to establish the cause of death and document the consequences of the attack without needing to turn the evidence into spectacle. Thiago, the unborn child Giulia was carrying, had also been lost. The case was now not only about a missing woman, it concerned 2 lives taken in the same act. The disappearance story had collapsed. Physical traces, digital searches, the false DNA document, surveillance evidence, witness information, and Alessandro's own admissions had dismantled it from different directions. Giulia and Thiago had been found, and the man who reported her missing was now charged with killing them. But finding the truth about what happened was not the same as answering every legal question. The evidence could establish a long campaign of deception and earlier harm. But in court, one word would remain fiercely contested: premeditation. Everyone in the courtroom knew Alessandro had killed Giulia. The central fight was no longer about identity, but about intention. When did the decision to kill become a plan? That question mattered because Italian law does not treat every murder in exactly the same way. The prosecution was not only asking the court to find Alessandro responsible for Giulia's death, it argued that the crime carried aggravating circumstances: the cruelty of the attack, the intimate relationship between the two, the way Giulia had been placed in a position of trust, and the deliberate effort to destroy or conceal evidence afterward. And then there was the most contested issue of all: premeditation. In plain terms, the prosecution had to argue more than "he behaved terribly after the killing." It had to show that the fatal attack itself belonged to a broader course of conduct, rather than being only a sudden explosion of anger. That distinction became the fault line running through the entire case. The evidence gave prosecutors plenty to work with. There was the research into poisons. Investigators found searches about toxic substances, their effects, and ways of harming someone without immediately being detected. There were also findings connected to the suspected attempts to poison Giulia before the stabbing. She had experienced fatigue, dizziness, nausea, and stomach pain. Prosecutors argued that these were not random details, but part of an earlier effort to remove the problem Alessandro believed Giulia's pregnancy had created. There was the fabricated DNA document shown to the other woman. Alessandro had used it to claim that Giulia's unborn child was not his, hoping to preserve one version of his life while discrediting another. He had manipulated both women, telling each of them a different story about the relationship, the pregnancy, and the future. Then came what happened after Giulia's death. He cleaned the apartment. He moved her remains. He sent messages from her phone, making it appear that she had chosen to leave. And he contacted police himself, reporting her missing while presenting a version of events designed to make her disappearance look voluntary. The prosecution's point was not simply that Alessandro had lied. It was that the lies formed a pattern. Each step appeared aimed at protecting his image, buying time, and controlling what other people believed had happened. The defense did not deny the killing. Instead, Alessandro claimed that the fatal attack was a sudden loss of control during the argument. In that version, he had not calmly carried out a prepared plan. He had reacted in a moment of rage, then panicked and tried to hide what he had done. That was his defense position. It was not an established fact. The court also heard from the other woman, whose testimony helped explain the structure of Alessandro's deception. She described how he had presented himself as single, how he had portrayed Giulia as someone from his past, and how he had insisted that the pregnancy was not real, or at least not his. She spoke about the false DNA document and the moment the two women met on May 27, 2023, discovering that neither had known the truth about the other. Her evidence mattered because it connected the private lies to the timeline immediately before the murder. But the courtroom did not turn her into a second culprit. She had been deceived too. Her guilt, distress, and later cooperation with investigators reflected the shock of learning that Alessandro had built two separate realities around them. Nothing about her meeting with Giulia made her responsible for the decision he made afterward. If anything, that meeting exposed how little control either woman had over the story Alessandro had created. Psychological evidence was treated more carefully than the early public commentary sometimes suggested. Experts described behavioral traits and patterns relevant to the proceedings, including strong narcissistic features and a lack of empathy as observed in his conduct. But this was not a license for armchair diagnosis. The legal question was not whether a label could explain everything. It was whether his behavior, before and after the killing, showed awareness, control, and a sustained effort to protect himself. Alessandro tried to present remorse in court. He said he could not understand how he had committed something so terrible. He characterized the killing as an act of uncontrolled anger, something he had not fully grasped while it was happening. Giulia's family did not accept that his courtroom words could be separated from everything that followed the attack. To them, remorse could not be measured only by what he said after arrest. It had to be considered alongside the messages sent from Giulia's phone, the false missing person report, the cleaning, the concealment, and the repeated attempts to shape the investigation. They remained present through the proceedings, carrying Giulia's name into a courtroom where the defendant's explanations threatened to dominate every conversation. They insisted that Giulia and her unborn son, Thiago, could not be reduced to evidence in Alessandro's trial. They were 2 lives taken, and their memory had to exist beyond the story he told about his own anger. In November 2024, the first instance court convicted Alessandro and sentenced him to life imprisonment. The judges accepted a severe picture of the crime, one involving cruelty, manipulation, an intimate relationship abused for control, and deliberate efforts to conceal what had happened. The verdict was widely understood as rejecting the idea that the entire case could be explained as one isolated outburst. The poison research, the suspected earlier poisoning attempts, the deception surrounding the pregnancies, the cleanup, the staged messages, and the disposal efforts all formed part of the prosecution's larger argument. Even where the court had to distinguish between separate pieces of evidence, the overall conduct was impossible to view as a single moment with nothing before or after it. But the first instance judgment was not the final word. The legal system still had to decide how the fatal attack itself should be classified. Evidence of earlier planning, preparation, or harmful intent could show a dangerous course of conduct. But it did not automatically prove that Alessandro had decided in advance to carry out the specific attack that killed Giulia. That distinction would become decisive on appeal. In June 2025, the appellate court left the life sentence intact, but removed the aggravating circumstance that had shaped much of the public understanding of the case. The appeal changed one part of the legal reasoning without changing the sentence. In June 2025, Italy's appellate court confirmed Alessandro Impagnatiello's life sentence for the murder of Giulia Tramontano, but it removed the aggravating circumstance of premeditation. That distinction matters, and it is easy to misunderstand. Removing premeditation did not mean the court found Alessandro innocent. It did not excuse the killing. It did not erase the evidence of his double life. The lies he told to Giulia and Allegra, the fabricated DNA document, the searches about poisons, or the attempts to conceal what he had done afterward. The sentence remained the same. What changed was the court's conclusion about one specific legal question: whether the prosecution had proved, to the required standard, that the fatal attack had been planned in advance in the precise way Italian law demands. That is a narrower question than, did he behave deceptively for months? It is narrower than, did he try to control the people around him? And it is narrower than, did he take steps before the killing that suggested he wanted Giulia gone? The record contained evidence of all those things. The poisoning evidence, the internet searches, the effort to manage 2 separate relationships, the fake test meant to deny responsibility for Giulia's unborn child, the concealment after her death. But legal premeditation is not simply a label for a person's previous cruelty or dishonesty. It has a specific threshold. A court can recognize a long pattern of manipulation and still decide that the evidence does not establish that particular aggravator beyond the required standard for the fatal act itself. That was the boundary drawn by the appeal. For the family, though, the decision could never be reduced to a legal definition. Giulia was not an argument about an aggravating circumstance. She was Loredana and Franco's daughter. She was a sister. She was a woman whose family had expected to welcome Thiago into the world, and that future had already become part of the family's daily life. They had names to say, plans to make, a child to meet. Giulia was 7 months pregnant when her life was taken, but her identity was never limited to that pregnancy. She had been building a career, making a home, moving through the world with the confidence and energy her family remembered. Thiago was part of the future she was preparing for, not a detail added to make the case more shocking. After the murder, Giulia's relatives kept returning the public conversation to that person, to the woman behind the headlines. Her mother, Loredana, spoke publicly through grief that never became abstract. Her father, Franco, and Giulia's siblings remained visible as the family sought answers, justice, and a way to protect her name from being swallowed by the crime. Their statements and appearances carried the same underlying message. Giulia had a life before Alessandro, and that life deserved to be remembered. The reaction across Italy was immediate and intense. Demonstrations and memorial events took place in cities, including Milan, Naples, and Rome. People gathered with photographs, candles, and signs calling for stronger responses to violence against women. Those protests placed Giulia's death within Italy's continuing discussion of femicide, domestic abuse, coercive control, and the warning signs that can be missed until intervention comes too late. But there is an important limit here. Giulia's case can contribute to that public discussion without being treated as a template for every form of gender-based violence. Not every abusive relationship looks the same. Not every act of violence follows the same path. And no single case can explain the entire problem. What this case does show, with painful clarity, is how deception can operate inside an intimate relationship. Alessandro did not need everyone to see the same version of reality. He needed each person to believe the version that served him. When Giulia discovered the truth and chose to leave, the story he had been controlling began to collapse. The investigation documented what happened next. The courts imposed the punishment. The appeal refined the legal finding. But the public question remains larger than the sentence. How should we understand the months of deception, the alleged attempts to poison Giulia, and the effort to control the narrative after she disappeared? And how do we hold those facts beside an appellate ruling that found the legal threshold for premeditation had not been met? There is no neat answer that makes those two realities identical. The law draws categories. Human behavior often refuses to stay inside them. What can be said with certainty is that Alessandro's life sentence remained in place. The punishment was not undone. The appellate ruling narrowed the conclusion about premeditation, but it did not return Giulia's life, Thiago's future, or the years her family expected to share with them. So her relatives continue the work that a verdict cannot complete. They preserve photographs of Giulia, not graphic images of a crime scene, but pictures of a daughter, a sister, and a young woman with plans. They speak her name. They remember the relationships, ambitions, and ordinary moments that existed before the headlines. And they keep Thiago's name connected to the future Giulia was building. Alessandro's sentence settled one part of the case. The appeal clarified another. But the distance between a documented pattern of control and the legal definition of premeditation remains difficult to ignore. That is the distinction I'd like to hear your thoughts on. Does removing the premeditation aggravator change how you understand the months leading up to the murder? Or does it only define what the court could legally prove? Leave your view in the comments. And if you want more long-form coverage of cases where the evidence, the courtroom, and the public memory do not fit into one simple sentence, subscribe to the channel.